everyone, welcome to another episode of Spin It Reviews. And today I'm going to be doing 3 last reviews for 2014, those being part of my Underground Corner series, where I talk about 3 albums from lesser known artists that I think all of you should know about. And remember, all the links for these bands, including social media, websites, song links, everything, are in the description. So without any further ado, let's get this thing started. The first album I'll be talking about today is the debut from Rough Francis called Maximum Soul Power. Now, when I was going through the albums I listened to in 2014, to make my year-end list, I realized something strangely missing from it, namely a great punk album. No, not pop punk, even though there is one of those in my top 10, arguably, as you'll see in that video, but just straight up punk rock. And with this album, I think I got that. Back in September, I went to the record store M Theory to see a free show from the band Grand Tarantula, who you guys might remember I put in my top 10 San Diego bands list, and they were opening for this band, Rough Francis. I wound up talking with one of their guitarists, Paul Comegno, a bit before the show, and found out the very interesting background behind this band. In a nutshell, a couple years ago, a documentary was released called A Band Called Death, which talked about the titular band as they were incredibly ahead of their time in terms of mid-70s punk rock, but wound up never having their material released due to problems with their record label. However, in the late 2000s, there was a sudden boost in popularity for Death because their singer's sons found their music online and promptly formed this band, Rough Francis, to cover their songs. And now, after 6 years, they finally have an LP of all original material. Admittedly, I still haven't gotten around to listening to the now-released Death albums beyond a couple tracks, but in a way I think that actually kind of helps in me looking at this on its own merits versus just how it compares to that. And with Maximum Soul Power, we have 27 minutes and 8 tracks of tight, well-written punk rock. Now, one thing I really love about this album is just how well-balanced it is. Sure, there's a generally aggressive, very in-your-face feel throughout the whole thing, but there's also a lot of attention paid to dynamics, sticky melodies, really building up intensity at times. It's not the kind of punk rock that just acts as a disposable mosh soundtrack, but rather the kind that puts a lot of emphasis on creating memorable songs with a lot of replay value. Going to specific tracks, songs like Not a Nice Guy and Righteous are probably the most straightforward punk songs on here, whereas songs like I-90 East and Home Invasion have a sort of bluesy feel to them in the riffs and guitar work and general structure, but in a way that feels rather fresh rather than just rehashed. I love the slow anthemic groove on Staring Out the Window that almost feels like a power ballad put through a rough underground punk filter, and my personal favorite song here, Black and Red, with the vocal delivery, the poppy melodies and backing vocals, and the chord progression that is as poppy as it is melancholy, almost feels to me like a Lost Smithereens song if it was put through a lot more distortion. And speaking of grooves, the closer Calm to Space is easily the most impressive song on here on a technical level, going on for an extremely justified 6 minutes. Sure, the guitar work and vocals were always pretty impressive on this thing, but here's where everything really seems to hit its peak in that department. Just rising and falling over and over again on this just addictive rhythmic groove, complete with these chilling screams every time the song really starts to rock out again. I initially had a problem with the fact this album was so short, again clocking in at under 30 minutes, around 27 to be exact, but the more I look at it, the more this really does feel like a complete package. So yeah, if you're looking for a really standout punk rock album, this comes highly recommended. Next up is the sophomore album from Shrink the Giant, called Faceless. Now, I actually did an interview with this band back in July on this channel, back when they were still working on this album. It was still being crowdfunded on Indiegogo. And after a couple months of delays, Faceless finally came out this December, and I have to say, it was worth the wait. Now, a lot of people throw around the term indie pop, most of the time to just apply to pop music they don't want to lose their hipster cred for liking. But in the case of Shrink the Giant, it's actually pretty accurate. Sort of like with, say, Vampire Weekend, or The Flaming Lips, or early MGMT, or some Beck albums. They have a very catchy, straightforward songwriting style, but they present it in a very quirky and eclectic way to add a certain extra punch to it and make the through listen all the more engaging. You got biting hard rock on Lovely Lucy, these cool little off-kilter electronics on Sly and Riptide I'm almost getting a Lordish feel from, the title track's rather bizarre mix of very pretty keyboards and vocal harmonies with guitar riffs straight out of a Tool album that actually kind of works. The clearly pop-punk inspired chorus in Fast and Far that, ironically enough, follows a verse more reminiscent of Blink-182's self-titled album than anything else, the bare bones piano ballad Response to Creep that has some of the best vocals on the album, and the nice gradual build and crash that really heightens the emotion of the song in a similarly effective way as, say, the Airborne Toxic event sometime around midnight. Now, the really interesting thing about me in this album is that I was initially introduced to it through acoustic sets. In fact, not counting a few songs from their first album, that's all I was going off of when I initially interviewed them. So I had a lot of time to sort of imagine in my head what the studio version would be like, and fortunately, I have to say, I'm happy with the results. Now, there are a few nitpicks, like how I wish the guitar was a bit higher in the mix on a couple tracks, or how I think a gang vocal approach would have worked a lot better for the backing vocals in the chorus of Fast and Far, or a couple weird vocal inflections in Southwalk, but again, those are very minor things and don't really detract from the album as a whole. I also want to touch on the lyrics, because there are definitely a few worth pointing out. Sure, there are some enjoyably fun songs like Southwalk and Fast and Far and Super 8s, but really where this album shines the most to me is on the more serious songs. The most impressive to me is Crash, an absolutely haunting second-person portrayal of someone suffering with regret after accidentally killing their family in a car crash, and dealing with the consequences both in the world around them and within themselves, and it's all told with just this really evocative imagery. Along with that, Sly and Lovely Lucy are charming, if a bit kitschy, rejections of people in life who might bring you down. Question mark is a motivating ode to taking chances and living life in the moment, and the weirdly titled Response to Creep is a sweet bit of reassurance to someone dealing with social insecurity. Now, none of the ones I just mentioned are extremely groundbreaking in their themes necessarily, but for what they set out to accomplish, they all work really well in their own right. Overall, if you're just looking for a really well-done indie pop rock album with relatable subject matter, versatile instrumentation, and infectious hooks, I'd definitely recommend Shrink the Giant's Faceless. And the last one I'm going to be recommending is definitely the most unknown act here, from a project called Abadeer and the album You're Sick If You Call It Beautiful. However, I'm not alone in this. I'm joined on Skype by the frontman and just general mind of Abadeer, Mr. Kevin Hatch.
How's it going?
Yeah. So I was introduced to Abadeer in a rather interesting way. It was in the middle of a local artist showcase at Soma, on a bill full of these bare-bones garage rock and pop-punk bands. I was actually there to support a friend of mine in a band called the Snikes. And at some point, they bring out this neon-painted piano, and a band consisting of a drummer, a violinist, and this guy just filled with this tense emotion moving around the stage, singing these really dramatic electro-indie pop-ish songs. Needless to say, it was a little jarring, but I walked out really interested, checked out your debut album, You're Sick If You Call It Beautiful, and wound up really enjoying it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess my main question is, how did this band, for lack of a better term, happen? Like, how did the ideas and concepts for this come together, at least musically, since there's definitely some very interesting stuff going on in this album?
Basically, it started off as just something like I sat down in my bedroom. It was around Halloween of 2013. I was like, I want to make something really, really weird and inaccessible that's almost like unlistenable in some ways, just really strange noises and stuff. And it ended up being like a 2-album thing, and I was like, okay, I'll probably do one live show and it'll never happen, because I just wanted to make something strange that when people saw it, they didn't really know how to react to it. Probably early this year, I was like, yeah, I could probably make some electronic songs, because I've always been really into theatricality, and the best way for me to do that, or the easiest way for me to do that, is to do it by myself. So I just did it in my bedroom, cranked out an album, and just went with it.
Yeah, like, even if there are more melodically pleasing songs on here, like Flood or Little Black Cloud or How the Quiet Hope, there's definitely this undercurrent of strangeness to the whole thing. Like, if we were going to throw out comparisons, I would probably say this was like a more bizarre and less accessible 21 Pilots, which anyone that knows me would know is a huge compliment, given Vessel was my album of the year last year.
Yeah, 21 Pilots, we kind of modeled our live show after that whole thing, and because I really like this like pop sensibility, kind of. and I always kind of like the idea of doing like pop-sounding songs with like really twisted, terrible meanings behind them, so that when people hear some of them, they're like, "Oh, that's kind of catchy," and then they like read the lyrics or listen to the lyrics, and they're like, "Wow, that's really terrible."
Yeah, I've always been a fan of that kind of dichotomy.
Yeah, it's fun, and we try to bring that in a live show too, with like not taking ourselves too seriously and just having fun, which is where the neon piano comes from and stuff. So
now, going back to the lyrics, there's definitely a lot of heavy subject matter tackled here. Depression, some hints at suicidal thoughts, which I'm guessing is echoed by the title and cover art on this thing, and even some religious undertones throughout this. And it's all done with a lot of cohesion. Like, again, there might be some overarching concepts to this whole thing, especially with how involved your stage presence was at that show. Would you mind going into a bit of the subject matter on this album?
I kind of like to think of it, and this might sound really strange, as kind of like the reverse church mentality of like, you know, you go to a church, or some churches, and it's like this very bright, positive kind of experience, and I wanted to take that kind of like feeling and make it about exposing like the worst parts of myself in a way that feels like this big, really charismatic church service kind of thing.
And how did the other two members of the group, the violinist and drummer, come into the fold? Was it just a group thing from the beginning, or was it more your brainchild and they just kind of popped on?
After the album was put on Bandcamp, I really wanted to do a show just for kicks, and we ended up doing a show in a coffee house, and I needed a drummer, and so I got Aaron on board because we do play in a ton of other bands. And then just a couple months ago, I wanted to start working strings, orchestral strings in a live show, and I found McCall, and I met her online, and we ended up meeting up and connecting, and we came together, and now we're three-piece.
Oh, okay, so you recorded this whole thing yourself?
Yeah, just all in my bedroom.
Oh, cool, since I actually record like that myself, track by track like that, right down to being in my bedroom. And yeah, it's an interesting process, even if obviously what I'm doing here is a bit more straightforward than what you're doing.
It's fun.
So I like to ask at the end of every interview I do what the artist's favorite albums of the year are, and especially since we're at the end of 2014, it's pretty appropriate. Kevin, you said you had a couple in mind?
Yeah, I'll start with probably what is probably my favorite, and that is Hebrews by Say Anything. Love that album. Love the theatricality of that album. Whole package, just amazing. Yeah,
makes sense. I mean, I haven't heard more than a couple songs from that album, but there's definitely a similar appeal when compared to Abadeer, I guess, especially in like how the whole thing is presented.
Yeah, they're kind of like this really grandiose kind of band. Another album that I loved was, which technically two albums, the Cope and Hope kind of albums by Manchester Orchestra. They're essentially the same album, just approached completely differently.
Okay, so if any of you guys are interested based on what you've heard, then go ahead and check out Abadeer's debut album, again called You're Sick If You Call It Beautiful. And Kevin, thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me.
So, those are three more artists I think you guys should know about. Again, if you're interested, all info on them is linked in the description. Also, even if I'm not going to technically get it out before the new year, rest assured the best albums of 2014 list is coming soon. So definitely stay tuned for that. Share this around with anyone who might be interested. Like the Facebook page in the description for updates, commentaries, music news, and reviews of older albums. If you guys are here because one of the artists I talked about linked you, then feel free to check out the other videos on this channel. And hopefully I'll see you in the next episode of Spin It Reviews. My cries are all never fade. Solidarity bound. I never tried to hold up. I just want when a change in my direction and my life
Waste my imagination on different ways to die and make a scene the same time. This isn't art, it's codependence. It's revenge, it may be worthless, but it's mine.